Since the publication of Jacob Burckhardt's seminal 19th-century work, The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, scholars have been deeply engaged with the question of why the Renaissance emerged when and where it did. Central to these inquiries are the reasons behind the Renaissance's origins in Italy, as opposed to other major European regions such as France or England. In this sixth lecture of our series on the age of the Renaissance, we will critically examine these foundational questions, exploring the specific historical, cultural, and socio-economic factors that positioned Italy as the birthplace of this transformative period. We will analyze the complex interplay of elements such as Italy's classical heritage, the impact of urbanization, the rise of a wealthy merchant class, and the influence of humanist thought. Furthermore, we will consider how Italy's unique political landscape, characterized by a network of competing city-states, created an environment conducive to artistic and intellectual innovation, setting it apart from the more centralized and less commercially dynamic contexts of France and England at the time. Through this exploration, we aim to deepen our understanding of the distinctive Italian context that sparked the Renaissance, shaping the course of Western history. The question of why the Renaissance began in Italy, particularly in the northern regions, rather than in other European countries like France or England, has been a subject of extensive scholarly debate, yielding various theories over time. One of the most prominent explanations points to the unique political and economic circumstances of 14th-century Italy. During this period, northern Italy was characterized by a mosaic of independent city-states such as Florence, Milan, Pisa, Venice, and Genoa, each governed as republics or principalities. Unlike other regions of Europe that were more politically centralized, these Italian city-states fostered a competitive environment that spurred innovation and cultural investment. A key factor contributing to the early emergence of the Renaissance in northern Italy was the region's rapid recovery from the crises of the 14th century, facilitated largely by its advantageous position in international trade. For centuries, northern Italian cities had been pivotal in trade routes connecting Europe with the Middle East, which brought substantial economic prosperity. This wealth, derived from commerce, allowed these city-states to not only recover quickly from economic downturns, but also to reinvest in their urban environments. An interesting development in these northern Italian city-states was the decision by wealthy merchants and leaders to invest surplus capital in the arts and architecture rather than in riskier ventures. This patronage of the arts became a defining characteristic of the Italian Renaissance, driving the remarkable flourishing of artistic and architectural endeavors. Thus, the economic prowess of northern Italy provided the financial foundation that was essential for the Renaissance to thrive. However, economic factors alone do not fully explain why the Renaissance took root in Italy. Another significant reason was the predominance of urban centers throughout the region. While Italy as a whole had significant urban hubs such as Rome and Naples in the south, northern Italy was particularly notable for its dense network of city-states. The areas between these cities, known in Italian as contado, were under the direct control of the cities and were primarily oriented towards supporting the urban economies, with inhabitants often paying taxes to the cities. This urban dominance created an environment where civic life and intellectual pursuits could flourish, providing a stark contrast to the rest of Europe, where feudalism and rural land ownership by noble lords were the norm. Many scholars argue that it was this distinctly urban lifestyle that created the optimal conditions for the Renaissance to emerge. The resurgence of classical antiquity, with its emphasis on Greco-Roman ideals, found a natural home in these urban settings. Classical Roman and Greek societies, which Renaissance thinkers sought to emulate, were also fundamentally urban, with a strong emphasis on city life, public discourse, and civic engagement, despite the fact that the majority of their populations lived in rural areas. This urban-centric model of society in northern Italy diverged sharply from the broader medieval European context, which was predominantly agrarian and characterized by manorial economies dominated by landed aristocrats and feudal lords. The Renaissance, with its revival of classical learning, humanism, and artistic innovation, was thus less likely to emerge in the feudal and agrarian societies of medieval France and England, where the social and economic structures were not conducive to such a cultural reawakening. In Italy, the combination of political fragmentation, economic prosperity, urbanization, and the legacy of classical antiquity created a uniquely fertile ground for the Renaissance to take root and flourish. Northern Italy during the late Middle Ages stood in stark contrast to the broader medieval European society, bearing significant similarities to the urban-centric and republican nature of ancient Rome. Unlike much of feudal Europe, where power was concentrated in the hands of monarchs and nobility, the Italian city-states of this region were characterized by their republican forms of government, a relative absence of aristocracy, and a vibrant civic culture. In most northern Italian cities, the aristocracy had been expelled or marginalized during the High Middle Ages, resulting in a unique political landscape where noble influence was minimal. This lack of feudal lords meant that governance was not dictated by hereditary privilege, but rather by councils and elected officials who managed the affairs of the republics. As a result, Italian leaders and scholars were compelled to seek guidance from classical texts to address their economic, political, and social challenges, drawing upon the works of ancient Roman and Greek philosophers, statesmen, and historians. The distinctiveness of northern Italian society, with its urban character and republican governance, set it apart from other medieval European societies, which were predominantly rural and feudal. The city-state's emphasis on commerce, civic participation, and public life necessitated a different approach to governance and problem-solving, one that found inspiration in the classical past rather than in medieval traditions. This classical orientation was further reinforced by the urban nature of these societies, which mirrored the city-centric structures of ancient Rome and Greece. It is important to note, however, that these Italian city-states were technically under the suzerainty of the Holy Roman Emperor during the High Middle Ages. In practice, though, the emperor's influence in northern Italy was minimal, allowing these city-states to function with considerable autonomy. They were not governed by monarchs or hereditary princes, but were self-ruled republics, much like the Roman Republic, with their own constitutions and civic institutions. This independence was so pronounced that by the late 14th century, the city-states often found themselves in conflict with one another, driven by rivalries and ambitions reminiscent of ancient city-state conflicts. One significant conflict that underscored this dynamic was the expansionist efforts of Milan under the Visconti family, who sought to establish a Milanese empire in northern Italy. The Visconti came close to realizing this ambition, but their plans were thwarted by the formidable resistance of two other major city-states, Venice and Florence. In response to Milanese aggression, Venice and Florence formed a strategic alliance, successfully pushing back against Milanese advances. The defeat of Milan by this coalition was a critical turning point, particularly for Florence, which subsequently emerged as a leading center of Renaissance culture. This period of intense rivalry and eventual Milanese defeat was one of the key factors that catalyzed the emergence of the Renaissance, particularly in Florence. The victory not only preserved the independence of these city-states, but also fostered an environment of intellectual and artistic flourishing, as the Florentines invested in the arts and humanist scholarship. The competition and cooperation among these independent city-states created a fertile ground for the revival of classical knowledge and the birth of the Renaissance, with Florence at its forefront. Following the decline of Milan, Venice emerged as the next great power in Italy, poised to establish its own empire. The origins of Venice date back to the period of the Great Migration, when the city was founded on a series of small islands in the Venetian lagoon. Constructed on wooden piles driven into the soft mud of the lagoon, Venice quickly transformed into a bustling commercial hub. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the city experienced significant economic growth, particularly through its lucrative trade in luxury goods from the East, which Venetian merchants acquired from Arab intermediaries in the Middle East. However, Venice's unique geographic position also posed distinct challenges. The city had a very limited hinterland, which meant that it lacked the agricultural capacity to sustain itself with food and other essential resources. This scarcity fostered an imperialist mindset among the Venetians, who came to view territorial expansion as necessary for their survival and prosperity. As a result, during the latter half of the 15th century, Venice pursued aggressive policies aimed at the conquest of parts of northern Italy. Venetian expansionism did not go unchallenged. Florence, perceiving a threat to its own position, allied itself with Milan and Rome to counter Venice's ambitions. This coalition successfully pushed back the Venetian forces, preserving the fragile balance of power that characterized the Italian peninsula during this period. In this context, Florence emerged as a critical arbiter, playing a unique role in maintaining political equilibrium amid the frequent wars and shifting alliances among the various Italian city-states. The Florentine experience illustrates the vital importance of diplomatic acumen, strategic thinking, military expertise, and political maneuvering in Renaissance Italy. For cities like Florence, survival in this turbulent environment required a deep understanding of these arts, which were often inspired by classical Greek and Roman texts. The study of ancient philosophies and strategies provided the intellectual foundation for the innovative approaches that these cities adopted in response to the complex dynamics of power, conflict, and diplomacy in the region. Venice's quest for expansion into the Italian mainland was driven not only by the necessity of securing resources, but also by a desire to establish itself as a dominant power in the region. As Venice sought to extend its influence, it encountered resistance from neighboring states, leading to a series of conflicts that underscored the volatility of the Italian political landscape. Florence, in particular, found itself in a precarious position. As a city-state that often sought to balance competing powers against one another, Florence had to carefully navigate its alliances and maintain a delicate equilibrium. The city's leaders understood that their survival depended on mastering the arts of diplomacy and warfare. By drawing on classical learning, Florentine statesmen and strategists developed sophisticated methods for negotiation and conflict management, ensuring that their city remained a vital player in the power struggles of Renaissance Italy. In addition to their foreign policy challenges, nearly all of the Italian city-states faced significant internal political strife. A notable example of this internal unrest is the workers' revolt in Florence in 1378, known as the Ciompi Revolt. During this period, the guilds representing employers attempted to freeze wages for the lower guilds, sparking a significant uprising. For a brief period, the lower classes managed to seize control of the Florentine government, a rare occurrence in a society where the lower social strata seldom held power. This state of affairs in the Italian city-states was a relatively recent development. In the late 14th century, the governance of these cities fell into the hands of wealthy merchant elites, often referred to as patricians, drawing a parallel with the elite ruling class of ancient Rome. However, this was not always the case. The so-called communes, which emerged in the 12th, 13th, and early 14th centuries, were initially characterized by broader political participation. In their early stages, these communal governments included not only the elite classes, but also lower social strata, particularly the lower guilds, who played a more substantial role in governance. Thus, the cities were far more democratic in their organization during this period. Over time, however, the upper classes, those same patricians, established their own power base and gradually usurped control from the lower social groups. Despite this shift, the lower guilds never forgot the principles that underpinned the idea of a commune, namely that governance should be a collective endeavor, and that all members of society should participate in the management of public affairs. This sentiment occasionally led to efforts by these groups to reclaim political power, as exemplified by the Ciompi Revolt in Florence. The members of the lower guilds sought opportunities to participate in city governance, attain public office, and thereby exert political influence. The prevailing sentiment among these groups was that governance should not be an oligarchy, a system controlled by a few elite individuals, but rather a republic in which all social classes could play a role in the political process. The tensions between the higher and lower social orders particularly between the patrician elites and the lower guilds, were instrumental in fostering a vibrant political culture. Politics became a matter of everyday life, much like in the ancient Greek polis, city-state, where public debate was a fundamental aspect of civic engagement. In this environment of political debate and contestation, there was a need to educate citizens in the art of rhetoric, debate, and public discussion. Without such an education, meaningful political engagement would have been impossible. This necessity gave rise to the importance of a classical humanist education, which trained individuals to articulate opinions, engage in civic responsibility, and participate in governance. The demand for citizens capable of contributing to public discourse reinforced the city-state's status as highly political societies. This emphasis on political engagement and education distinguished the Italian city-states from other European cities and monarchies of the time. In most of Europe, political power was centralized in the hands of kings, emperors, or princes who wielded absolute authority. Subjects were expected to obey, and any form of public debate or political participation was discouraged. Similarly, within the Church, there was a pronounced aversion to politics. Political debate was viewed as a threat to ecclesiastical authority, and participation in political discourse was not only discouraged but seen as an evil to be suppressed. The Italian city-states, by contrast, developed a unique political culture that embraced debate, participation, and a more republican form of governance. This openness to political engagement was a crucial element in the birth of Renaissance humanism. It fostered an environment where intellectual curiosity, critical thinking, and the questioning of authority could flourish. The political life of the Italian city-states, with its emphasis on republican ideals and civic participation, played a fundamental role in the emergence of Renaissance thought, setting the stage for a cultural and intellectual revival that would transform Europe. By cultivating a political environment that encouraged public discourse and civic responsibility, the Italian city-states stood apart from the prevailing monarchical and ecclesiastical norms of their time. Their emphasis on humanist education and political participation was not only a reaction against the oligarchic tendencies within their own societies, but also a challenge to the broader, more authoritarian structures of medieval Europe. Thus, the unique political and cultural conditions in these city-states became a critical catalyst for the Renaissance, reshaping European society in profound and lasting ways. Humanism was the intellectual foundation and driving force that paved the way for the Renaissance. It aimed to prepare individuals for active participation in political life, which was seen as not only a right, but a virtuous duty. This perspective on political engagement stood in stark contrast to the medieval church's view, which often regarded politics with suspicion or outright disdain. This difference in attitudes toward political life marks one of the most significant distinctions between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Renaissance thinkers understood that medieval literature, which was predominantly religious in nature, offered little guidance on matters of politics. As a result, they turned to the classical works of Greek and Roman authors to find inspiration and solutions. These classical societies, especially the Roman Republic, provided models that seemed relevant to the political conditions of the Italian city-states, where civic engagement and public discourse were becoming increasingly important. The Renaissance thus witnessed a revival of Greek and Roman political thought, particularly the republican ideals that emphasized active civic participation. One of the most influential figures for Renaissance humanists was the Roman statesman and philosopher Cicero, who embodied the ideal that all citizens should participate in public life and contribute to the political processes of their communities. Cicero's writings on the virtues of public service and the importance of balancing various interests in governance became a model for Renaissance thinkers. Humanists believed that political debate and participation were crucial to the health of a republic. They argued that a well-functioning political community should encourage a diversity of viewpoints and allow different perspectives to be heard. This process of open discussion and debate was seen as essential for reaching either a compromise or a collective decision through voting. It was through these participatory processes that individuals became educated in public life, learn to understand and appreciate differing opinions, and develop the capacity for critical thinking. This commitment to civic engagement and the revival of classical ideas about politics fundamentally shaped the character of the Renaissance. Humanism was not just an academic pursuit, but a practical tool for building a more participatory society. By advocating for a return to the classical republican ideals, Renaissance humanists sought to create a political culture that valued debate, civic responsibility, and public service. In doing so, they laid the groundwork for the intellectual and cultural transformation that defined the era. Thus, humanism's emphasis on education, rhetoric, and the study of classical texts became a means of fostering a citizenry capable of meaningful participation in public affairs. This humanist education aimed to cultivate virtues such as eloquence, wisdom, and civic virtue, which were seen as essential qualities for anyone involved in the governance of a republic. Through this process, humanism contributed to the creation of a political environment in which citizens were encouraged to engage in the civic life of their communities, debate openly, and contribute to the common good. In our next lecture, we will explore the concept of civic humanism. During the Renaissance, this movement sparked a major reform in education. An academic program was developed that focused on the study of classical authors, incorporating subjects like grammar, rhetoric, and philosophy. By the 15th century, this curriculum became known as Studia Humanitatis. Its purpose was to develop well-rounded individuals equipped to make meaningful contributions to public life. Those who followed this path were called humanists, committed to reviving classical knowledge and applying it to both civic and personal growth.